As uncertainty looms over the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce estimates over 700,000 workers in Arizona depend on free trade and keeping trade routes open. Professor Jeff Kucik studies trade law at the U of A School of Government and Public Policy and says deals like NAFTA are about creating stability in the marketplace.
There are a few interesting changes. So there have been updates to existing provisions relating to environmental standards and labor rights. There are also a couple of new elements of the deal, things that weren't as relevant, frankly, when the original NAFTA was negotiated. So rules relating to e-commerce, some more robust intellectual property rights provisions, something that the Trump administration obviously cares a lot about. He's mentioned that as part of his justification for current policies toward China, for example. So there are some changes, but the vast majority of the treaty text looks a lot like the original NAFTA.
You mentioned labor and the environment. That's not to say that those issues were not a factor in the previous NAFTA agreement, correct?
So NAFTA was one of the first modern trade deals to have a lot of detailed provisions relating to the environment and labor. Now those are relatively standard in trade deals around the world, but NAFTA was really ahead of its time in that regard. Now there's a difference between having rules and actually having enforceable standards with which member countries comply. And there's always been a question mark over whether labor rights provisions, for example, in a trade deal actually have any positive effects for your average worker, whether that's in the United States or Canada or Mexico. And I think a lot of labor watchdogs and organized labor organizations would say that those provisions of the NAFTA text were always basically lip service and didn't do a lot of good.
Who's ultimately the gatekeeper to ensure it's handled differently this time around?
Well, there's a question mark over enforcement in any trade deal. So that's a really great question, and that was one of the key sticking points in the recent negotiations. So one thing the Trump administration really wanted was to remove Chapter 19 of the original NAFTA agreement. Now, Chapter 19 relates to how disputes between the member countries get settled. Trump wanted to do away with the principal dispute settlement provisions. Canada stood firm on that, so dispute settlement remained in the updated deal. But that's the principal enforcement mechanism. When countries allege that someone's violating the terms of the agreement, they can sue one another under Chapter 19 of the NAFTA text.
Had that ever happened under the current NAFTA?
Yeah, so the United States, as we've heard a lot from the Trump administration, gets sued quite frequently under international trade law. That includes NAFTA, activating NAFTA provisions. It also includes activating provisions of the World Trade Organization in Geneva. So the Trump administration has actually been correct to point out that the United States is sued more often than any other country in the world. It's worth pointing out that the U.S. also initiates disputes against other countries more often than anyone else. So we're participating in both directions or on both sides of the case.
In this trade deal, the automotive industry has been a robust component. Does it increase under this new one, or does it remain pretty similar?
So there are stronger automotive provisions in USMCA. The most notable one, or the one we hear the most about, is that 40% of cars sold in the United States have to be made by automotive workers who are earning at least $16 an hour. There are a couple of different ways to interpret that rule. One is that it might sound like good news for organized labor because it implies some kind of minimum wage has been introduced. 40% of the car has to be made by somebody making $16 an hour. Sounds good. It's actually thinly veiled trade protection because your average Mexican auto worker makes far, far less than that. It's unlikely that they're going to get a raise up to that $16 an hour. So it's essentially a rule designed to keep U.S. car jobs in the United States.
How does USMCA impact Arizona differently than NAFTA did?
Well, there are a couple of interesting things that are relevant for Arizona in particular. If we think back to the original debates over NAFTA in the late 80s, early 90s, one of the major sticking points was what are NAFTA's effects going to be on immigration? So NAFTA supporters said it's going to create economic opportunity, it's going to generate wealth, it's going to make workers in all three countries better off, and that it will reduce immigration across the US-Mexico border. The critics of the deal said the opposite's going to be true, that having a free trade deal is going to increase immigration because it's going to open the border to trade, and by extension, it's going to allow for more migration. And the data on this is actually mixed. We saw a large uptick in immigration from Mexico into the United States in the first 5 to 10 years after NAFTA was created. Since then, it's plateaued rather dramatically. So immigration, it remains a big issue when we're talking about free trade in North America.
Because USMCA appears to be in a holding pattern here in the United States at least, what becomes of the current trade agreement, NAFTA, as it is right now?
Well, there's a question mark right now over whether USMCA is even going to be ratified. So in the US Congress, there's a decision to be made about whether a democratically held House wants to, on the one hand, give Trump a political victory by ratifying USMCA, or deny Trump a victory at the expense of leaving this question mark over whether free trade is going to remain intact in the region. And most people, I think, would argue that having some deal is better than having no deal. And we've seen what the uncertainty around the current trade wars is doing to the US economy. We've seen what the uncertainty during USMCA negotiations is doing to the US economy. So I think failure to ratify a deal is going to be very bad news for the country and including the state of Arizona.
Okay, Dr. Jeff Kucik from the U of A School of Government and Public Policy, thank you.
Thank you.